Hello and welcome. My name is Julie Steenhuysen, and I'm a health and science correspondent at Reuters. This is a live online Q&A about the recently approved Alzheimer's drug, aducanumab. It's also known as Aduhelm, as well as a broader discussion about accelerated drug approvals. You can post your questions on Facebook at forumhsph, or you can email them to the forum@hsph.harvard.edu. This Q&A is jointly presented by the Forum at the Harvard T.H. Chan School of Public Health and Reuters. With me is Dr. Aaron Kesselheim, professor of medicine at Harvard Medical School and director of the program on regulation, therapeutics, and law at Brigham and Women's Hospital. Dr. Kesselheim served on an independent advisory committee to the FDA that nearly unanimously rejected the drug, asserting a lack of convincing evidence that it slowed the progression of cognitive decline in patients with Alzheimer's, and that it also presented some safety concerns. The FDA chose to approve the drug, concluding that the benefits of Aduhelm for patients with Alzheimer's outweighed the risks of the therapy. In the aftermath of that approval, Dr. Kesselheim and several other members resigned from the advisory committee. Since then, and amid the controversy, the FDA has both clarified who should receive the drug and called for an independent investigation into interactions between the FDA and the drug's developer, Biogen. Aaron, there's a lot to unpack here. We've been waiting nearly 2 decades for a new Alzheimer's treatment, and many cheered when aducanumab was approved. Can you help us understand the concerns that you and others have raised?
Sure, Julie, thank you very much for inviting me to join you for this event, and it's a pleasure to be able to chat. And I too, was one of those people who was waiting for a great new treatment for Alzheimer's disease. As a primary care doctor, I have patients with Alzheimer's disease. I have family members who have suffered from dementia, and I know what a devastating disease it is, and how important it is to have new therapeutics to treat it, because the ones that we currently have are not very effective. That being said, I think that there were 2 problems with the aducanumab decision. I think there was a problem related to the process of the decision making, and then I think there was a problem with the decision itself. Aducanumab is a monoclonal antibody that removes, that is targeted for amyloid plaques in the brain, which are protein deposits that are found in patients with Alzheimer's disease, although they're also found in patients who don't have Alzheimer's disease, and we're not exactly sure what role they do play in the pathogenesis of Alzheimer's disease. But aducanumab is a monoclonal antibody that is successful at reducing the appearance of amyloid plaques on PET imaging scans. And as a result, there was a lot of promise about the clinical effects of the drug. And so the company Biogen, to its credit, organized 2 large prospective trials intended to test the effect of the drug on Alzheimer's patients' cognitive function. And they enrolled patients with early Alzheimer's disease and evidence of amyloid plaques. But they had a pre-specified review of the data by a data safety monitoring board that Biogen had organized to determine whether it appeared that the drug was futile. And unfortunately, about halfway through the trial, when the data came in, that board evaluated the data and found that it was futile, and Biogen shut the trial down. And that was very disappointing. But what happened was that a little bit more data came in, and Biogen analyzed the 2 studies individually and found that in one of the arms, in one of the trials, the high dose arm, it appeared as if the cognitive function of people with Alzheimer's disease, that their decline slowly lessened by just a little bit over placebo. In the other high dose arm, in the other trial, there was no effect. And actually the people with placebo did slightly better, but there was no statistically significant difference. And they brought this information to the FDA, and they worked with the FDA over a number of months to try to understand why the positive trial was positive and the negative trial was negative. And they presented that information to us at the advisory committee meeting back in November. I believed, and the rest of the advisory committees also believed, that those post hoc analyses trying to understand what was going on in the trials was, potentially hypothesis generating, and suggested, ideas and approaches that maybe should be tested in subsequent trials. but we did not think that they presented convincing enough evidence to approve the drug on its own, because you have the one trial that shows that there's a possibility that it might work, another trial that shows that it doesn't work, and when you put them together, you don't get a clear picture about whether or not the drug actually works. The FDA then in June approved the drug not on the basis of cognitive decline, which was what we discussed at the advisory committee meeting, but on the ability of the drug to reduce amyloid plaque, which is something that the drug is known to do, but the clinical impact of the reduction in amyloid plaque is not clear. The FDA instead said that they were approving the drug on the basis of this accelerated approval pathway because the changes in amyloid plaque are reasonably likely to predict clinical benefit. And, unfortunately, I don't think that there is, I think it's possible that it might make this kind of effect, but I think that you need to test that in a study in order to try to make that conclusion. The FDA nonetheless approved the drug. They made a couple other kind of questionable choices around the approval. They approved the drug for all patients with Alzheimer's disease initially, although they have subsequently revised the label to indicate that the drug should be started in patients with early Alzheimer's disease, as it was done in the clinical trials. And they gave the company 9 years to complete a follow-up post-approval study to try to confirm this reasonable suspicion that changes in amyloid plaque might affect cognitive function. And so the drug was approved, and now Biogen is making the drug available at an extremely high price because in the U.S. we allow drug companies to charge whatever they want for their new drugs, and this leaves patients and doctors in a and their family members in a big quandary about what to do about the drug. There is this lack of clear evidence that the drug actually works. I didn't even mention the side effects, but in the clinical trials, the drug was associated with brain swelling and bleeding in about a third of the patients who took it. And some of those patients had very severe symptoms that required hospitalization and required MRIs to monitor the effects of the drug and these side effects. And so there's a substantial risk associated with this drug, both bodily and from a financial point of view, and unclear benefits. And so, I think that the process was problematic, and I think that the decision itself was problematic as well.
Thank you for walking us through all of that. It was a very complicated approval, and I have some questions for you. There's been a lot in the aftermath. I mean, we do know that, for example, a couple of major hospital systems have actually, Cleveland Clinic and Mount Sinai have actually said that they are not going to infuse patients with the drug until they get a little bit more clarity here. What I wanted to ask you is this: instead of following the advice of your its advisors, they use this accelerated approval pathway, which is basically designed to speed access to drugs for which there are no other meaningful treatments. I'm just wondering, though, Alzheimer's is a disease for which there are no other meaningful treatments, and it is a fatal disease. What is the harm here for patients to have this drug approved on the idea that it could do them some good?
Well, I think there are a lot of harms. I think that there is, first of all, the very immediate harm and the fact that the drug doesn't actually, the side effects that are associated with the drug and the risks that you take by infusing the drug into your body. So I think that there is the very immediate harm of the product. I think there is also the harm to patients who are going to be paying a lot of money for this drug, that they could be using that money for other supportive care for people with Alzheimer's disease, that home health aides, other non-pharmacologic approaches that we know can make people who have Alzheimer's disease live better lives during the course of the very protracted course in some of the patients of their illness. I think there's also a harm to the generation of the actual data that we need to know about whether or not the drug works in the first place. Because again, now that the drug is approved, the manufacturer was given 9 years to complete these follow-up studies. And in other accelerated approval drugs, the FDA has not been as sort of restrictive as we might like in holding pharmaceutical manufacturers to the timelines that they set up for those post-approval trials. And then sometimes in some of the cases when those post-approval trials are negative, the drugs have, or their indications have remained on the market too. So we may not know for 9 years if the drug actually works, and we may never know if the drug will actually work. So I think that there are harms on a lot of different levels.
I'm just going to throw this, it's sort of to the same point, but it's a question from one of our viewers, from Violet. And she says the FDA has said that the benefits outweigh the risks with this drug, and we need Alzheimer's treatments. Don't all drugs have risks? And why are we so worried about this one?
Well, I think that's a great question. And the FDA has said that the benefits of the drug that the FDA pointed out are that it reduces amyloid plaques. And the FDA says that it thinks that there is a reasonable likelihood that might translate into actual clinical improvement. But I think that we need to understand what the basis is for that reasonable likelihood. There is not a lot of clarity in the literature about amyloid plaques and the extent to which they actually affect cognitive function. In fact, there have been dozens of drugs in the past that have targeted amyloid plaques and not have any effect on cognitive function. Some of them have actually even worsened cognitive function. And that's why we need to be testing real clinical endpoints when we test this surrogate measure, because there isn't clarity about how the surrogate measure might actually affect you. So I think that the benefits are potential benefits. They're not actually demonstrated benefits. And it might actually be that this drug is different from all the ones that have come before. It might actually be that there is something new about the way that we're dosing this drug to make it different. That, by the way, it didn't appear that way in the 18 months of therapy that in the two big trials that the patients who already received the drug got. But it might be that there is some other way of using the drug that where that might come out. But we don't know that until we actually do a trial and test that. And so putting the drug out there on the market for to try to have individual patients decide if they might take a drug that doesn't have clear benefits, that has substantial risks and has substantial costs, that's not what the FDA was designed to do. The FDA was designed to ensure that the drugs that are out there that are available for patients have some demonstrated benefit that patients can rely on when they consider whether or not to take the medicine.
This is the first time that the accelerated approval pathway has been used for an Alzheimer's drug. Traditionally, it started out for HIV treatments, and it's mostly been used for cancer drugs. Is there a concern, given the size of this market and the number of people, who might be testing this out, should be using this pathway with, a disease like Alzheimer's?
Well, look, I think that the accelerated approval pathway has done a lot of good. There have been, certain circumstances where accelerated approval has been totally reasonable. And there have been some really important drugs that have come through the accelerated approval pathway. And so it might be reasonable to apply the accelerated approval pathway to a disease like Alzheimer's disease. But I do think there needs to be good science behind the surrogate measure that's used. And so if the FDA knows about really, some really clear scientific evidence that has provided a reasonable likelihood of the link between the surrogate measure and the endpoint, then they should share that, because I don't think there is a lot of clarity around that in the field right now. So I think that it is reasonable. It is potentially reasonable for the accelerated approval pathway to be used in this case. I think that it's also important, by the way, if we are going to use accelerated approval for a condition as prevalent as Alzheimer's disease, that we try to be as clear as possible so that people understand the basis on which this drug was approved. This drug was not approved because people think that it affects cognitive function. It was approved because people know that it affects amyloid plaque, but they don't know what the association is between affecting amyloid plaque and cognitive function. And so that kind of nuance, and that is I think not being communicated right now in a lot of the public statements around this drug, where people are thinking like, oh, it's the first new treatment for Alzheimer's disease, it's going to improve people's cognitive function. There is actually no evidence that it's going to do any of those things. It's approved because it changes a surrogate measure. And I think that when you do approve drugs through the accelerated approval pathway, that you need to be extra careful and provide extra clarity around those points, so that people really do understand the limited basis on which this drug was approved.
You mentioned that there were some concerns about the process by which the FDA conducted itself and its interactions with the company. I mean, actually, FDA's acting commissioner, Dr. Janet Woodcock, has asked the Inspector General to take a look at how the FDA and Biogen representatives interacted. What I want to know is what happens if the Inspector General determines that there was something improper in that relationship? Does that void or the approval, or what happens next, I guess?
Yeah, it's a really good question. It's a little bit unprecedented, but yes. So so as I mentioned earlier in our discussion, there was this long period of interaction between the company and the FDA after the initial trials were declared futile. And again, it is totally reasonable for companies to interact with the FDA because I think that the sharing of ideas helps companies better prepare their products for approval. It helps the FDA get prepared for getting new submissions to them. And so there are a lot of ways where it's important for companies and the FDA to interact. The important thing, though, is that when the regulated entity, the company, interacts with the regulator, that it be transparent, and that there be evidence that this happened, and just so that people know that there is an arm's length relationship between the FDA and the companies who are trying to get their drugs approved by the FDA. And it seemed like in subsequent reporting out of Stat News after the drug was approved, that there were some off the books interactions between the company and the FDA, and I think that's what the Inspector General has been asked to investigate. And I happen to think that there's a lot more to investigate than just that. I think that we should be investigating all the interactions along the way, not just these specific ones, to try to understand what role FDA took in the sort of post hoc studies in which they evaluated the drug, how it was that they switched their premise of approving it based on cognitive function to approving it based on surrogate measures. I think there's a lot of stuff to investigate. Ultimately, what happens with that investigation? Will it, what will it mean for the drug's approval? I don't really know. I mean, I think that at the very least, if they identify some important gaps in transparency, that it will change the way that those kinds of meetings are registered and where there's records of them in the future. I don't know what effect it might have on the approval itself. That we'll have to see what the investigation uncovers.
Has there ever been a drug rescinded after an investigation like this? Do you know?
I am not aware of that ever happening.
Okay. Well, lots to learn, lots to come. So I also wanted to talk about the cost of this drug, which you mentioned. It's $56,000 a year. Most of the individuals who would be considered for this drug are covered by Medicare, the federal insurance program for the elderly in this country. What can or should Medicare do to rein in this cost, which a lot of people have considered to be excessive?
I think that by all objective measures, it is an excessive cost. There was an independent organization called ICER based out of Boston that did an analysis and said that even if you take the most optimistic, most rosy picture of the effect that this drug has, which is, by the way, an extremely small effect. This is not a curative treatment. This does not improve your cognitive function. It slows decline a little bit in one of the arms of one of the trials. And if you would just don't take away all the negative data and just assume that that's the effect the drug has, that a reasonable cost for the drug might be in the $3,000 to $8,000 a year range. So $56,000 a year as a price, which might even be higher, again, because it's a weight-based dosing. That reflects the fact that in the United States, we allow pharmaceutical companies to set whatever price they want for drugs. And then there are rules that make it challenging for payers like Medicare or Medicaid to not cover drugs. And so in this case, Medicare Part B, this is a Medicare Part B drug. It's an infusion that's given in a hospital setting. Medicare Part B usually covers FDA-approved drugs. And now, Medicare Part B, by the way, only covers 80% of the cost. So 20% of that cost falls on patients' shoulders. A lot of patients have Medigap or other insurance policies that cover. Some patients will pay that money out of pocket. Other patients will have, additional subsidies. But, some of that not only does like our tax dollars cover the 80% that's covered by Medicare, but then there are the additional payments that are being made by individuals. So in this case, just last week, Medicare announced that it was going to undergo a review of the drug and determine whether or not to put some restrictions on its prescribing. And they call this a national coverage determination. And it's about a 9-month-long process where Medicare reviews the data on which the drug is based to try to determine if there are restrictions that Medicare will place on the drug. Medicare does this very, very rarely for drugs, and it issues these coverage restrictions, again, very rarely. We'll see what it does in this case. It might say, for example, that a patient needs to be at a certain stage of their Alzheimer's disease in order to get a prescription for a drug, or that they need some diagnostic test like a PET scan or something like that before they can be prescribed the drug. Those are the kinds of ways that they might try to limit use of the drug, because a person who unfortunately has moderate or severe Alzheimer's disease, they weren't even included in those original Biogen trials. So there's just no basis at all for trying to assume what the effect of the drug might be on those patients.
So we have a question from Kat. Did the FDA or Biogen or ask Alzheimer's patients, their families, or patient advocacy groups what they think about the benefits and risks of making this drug available, given the limited evidence? And if they did, what did they think? And if not, do you think that the FDA could benefit from this patient perspective?
I think the FDA can always benefit from a patient perspective. And in fact, the FDA takes a patient's, evaluates and takes into account patients' perspectives quite frequently in the course of their the way that they run their agency. They have a patient-focused advisory committee. They have outreach in which they have meetings with patients about diseases that have unmet medical need to try to think about how to best address those problems. They use patient-reported outcomes as part of the evaluations of new drugs. So there are a lot of different ways that patients' opinions are taken into account in the regulatory process. And in fact, there is also time set aside at advisory committee meetings for patients to address the advisory committee. And in this case, there is a very active patient group, the Alzheimer's Association, that has come out very strongly in favor of this drug. Now, the Alzheimer's Association gets funding from Biogen, which has led some people to have questions about the independence of the Alzheimer's Alzheimer's Association's decision making. But I do think that there are a lot of patient voices out there. What the FDA doesn't do is the FDA doesn't sort of present all of the evidence around a drug and all of the potential benefits and all the potential risks to a representative sample of patients from around the country before they approve the drug. They don't go through that kind of direct communication process around decisions. Usually, the patient voices might be filtered through the Alzheimer's Association, or other advocacy groups, which might have their own conflicts of interest that need to be considered. So, it is possible that the FDA could do more to try to survey real patients' perceptions around the country around this product. But I think the FDA already does a good job trying to take those into account.
I'm going to push back on this just a little bit. So the FDA did say that they took into account patients, and they also said that they considered patients who voiced willingness to accept a fair amount of uncertainty about the efficacy of this drug. But I'm just wondering, we have been inviting patient voices more and more into this decision-making process. And as you intimated, there is some concern that drug companies are funding some of this activity. So what is the appropriate role for patient advocates in this process? And do they need to disclose funding? Or, how do you do it in a way that you feel like that's appropriate?
It's a really challenging question. I think that there are some ways that the current system isn't doing justice to the wide spectrum of patient perspectives. For example, at the advisory committee meeting, which, well, in this case, it happened online, but most advisory committees in a non-pandemic situation happen, at the FDA's headquarters in suburban Maryland on a random weekday. And as a result, the patients who end up making it to those meetings tend to be the ones whose travel can be funded by the pharmaceutical company or an advocacy group that also gets funding from the company as well. And that can skew the perspectives that are presented at that particular meeting. So I do think there needs to be more thought to this issue so that we not only get patients' perspectives, but we get the wide gamut of patients' perspectives, a full spectrum of them, so that we understand, not only the patients who are, whose travel is funded or who are motivated to come to a particular meeting, but also ones who aren't necessarily motivated to do that, but still have important perspectives to distribute to the to provide to this to decision making around this drug and other drugs. So I think that integrating patients' perspectives is incredibly important. I think that on the other hand, we also need to recognize that patients' perspectives are still anecdotal evidence, and we need to weigh that against the randomized trials and other trials that are done to actually figure out how well a drug works. But I think all of those different lines of information can be integrated into a decision-making process, and we just need to try to figure out the best way to do that.
I wanted to, here's another question. This is from Annalisa. While a drug is being considered for approval, what kind of contact is normal between the FDA and the company advancing the drug, and for that matter, between a company and the doctors who ultimately prescribe it? What is ethical?
Well, those are two different questions and two very good ones. I think that there are regular meetings that the FDA has with companies that are going through drug development at the end of the different trials that they run, where the company will kind of say, look, here's what we're going to do for the next stage in development, and the FDA will give an informal reaction to what's going on. Sometimes companies can have emergency meetings that they, if there's new information or issues that are coming up in the process. So there are, scheduled meetings, there are opportunities for emergency meetings, all of which are, transparent and on the books. And so that, I think, is the appropriate interactions that occur between a company and the FDA. In terms of, in terms of physicians, after a drug is approved, pharmaceutical companies spend $20 to $30 billion a year marketing their drugs to physicians, and most of the interaction that occurs after the drug is approved occurs through this, through the prism of those of that marketing spending. And so, you'll get sales reps that'll go out from a company to physicians to encourage them to prescribe the drug. Companies will fund continuing medical education. The problem is that all of these, interactions tend to be ones that favor prescription of the drug rather than, providing a, neutral, unbiased presentation of the evidence. So I think that there also are ethical issues relating to how physicians interact with companies, and we need rules to try to make sure that there are, fair presentations of the information through those channels.
Well, we've had a very robust discussion, and there are a lot of questions we weren't able to get to, but I wanted to say, thank you again for fielding these questions. This Q&A has been jointly presented by the Forum at Harvard T.H. Chan School of Public Health and Reuters. And thank you to our viewers for watching.
Thank you, Julie. This has been a lot of fun.